The Vicksburg Amateur Radio Club, radioactive on the Mississippi River, presents Gordon West, WB6NOA. Recorded sounds of hams live in an emergency. November 20th, 2023, joined in progress.
And the rules and regulations come out of Part 97, and the very first rule, Part 97.1, Basis and Purposes of the Amateur Radio Service, is recognition of the value of amateur radio operators to provide emergency communications. Now hold for 1 second. Let me just do this here. So the key word is provide emergency communications. And where you're located, you've had your share, as we have out here in Southern California, of emergencies. And you know, the good ham is one that has great training. And some of the very best training comes from nationally the American Radio Relay League's Amateur Radio Service. So anyone wearing this patch, you know that they've been vetted, they have been trained, and they're going to be probably a great emergency communicator. But you know, being just a great emergency communicator, with whom are you going to communicate messages to? Well, many of you may be members of your American Red Cross, and you've got that patch that is showing. Some of you are with Navy, Army, Air Force, Mars, or the U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary, and you've got this patch. Some of you have EMT training and first aid training. You got this patch. Some of you are recognized by the state of Mississippi, and you've got your patch here. Some of you are recognized by your local city as an emergency communicator, and you've got this patch. And out here in California, we got the big patch for our emergency group called California Rescue. So you're ready. You know what emergencies are all about. You've got your patches, you got your ID cards. Let's listen to see how some of the hams handle emergency communications, and we'll give them a little bit of a good rating. And most of them just do a fine job. But like us all, if you haven't had an emergency every other week, you get a little bit out of practice. But here's a ham that is radioing in what he has seen on a small island off of California when the smoke is billowing.
Delta. Fire is spreading over the Country Club Drive rapidly. 5 homes are in immediate danger. We need evacuation now of these homes.
Well, he sounded pretty calm when all these homes are going up in smoke. Now, let me just see your hands, if I may. Is that audio coming through okay? Over. And is everybody hearing the audio?
Yeah.
Is that yes?
Yeah.
Okay, good. All right. Want to make sure. And many times when you're relaying a report from fire department or one of the emergency operators, you're going to find that they too may want to speak. And here's a fire captain. We found out later he was a ham.
A copy of that advised that insurance dispatches evacuation for the evacuation, and the water company has to notify also Public Works.
So do we have a CERT team in your area? And that can be either a yes or a no, but you know the Community Emergency Response Team is a good operation that works closely with ham radio operators to help them learn how to handle their small little 2-watt family radio service radios. Now, as the fire begins to spread, listen to this call. Here it comes. Here we are.
All homes the club engulfed in flames. And further researching, we still have no water pressure at this time.
Well, that's a problem, and that's something that the hams were able to relay to the fire department, that they've got the hoses out, everything's good, but no water pressure. And here's the response.
Fire stop, yes. Fire stop, areas. Helicopters are incoming to make water drops on those structures.
Well, let's turn from sunny Southern California, where we have plenty of fires, down to your neck of the woods in Mississippi and talk about Katrina. Oh my gosh, you all went through Katrina. We can imagine what it was like. Listen to a ham on 40 meters in the evening that we heard out here giving his Katrina wind and weather report. And he sounds a little stressed, but he did a nice job of handling the call. Here he comes.
About 3 inches of rain since last night. We don't have any electricity. The heavy rock is out. The winds are vaccinating and stuff up over 50. We have broken furniture lying on that I want to say. I'm 20.
Wow, wind up at 50 miles per hour. How many of you, and let me see your hands, how many of you went through Katrina and had the high winds and so on? Oh yeah, a bunch of you. Well, we can feel for what you were going through. Well, as the hurricane came ashore, later on came a report out of Slidell. And I'm not sure how close you are to Slidell, but they had their fair share of a lot of wind. And listen to this ham radio report regarding Slidell.
Report from Alpha Delta 5, Delta Papa. The National Weather Service in Slidell has lost all ATF radio operations. Over.
Wow, the National Weather Service, which operates on one of the 5 megahertz NTIA channels, lost their sideband capabilities. But you know, we have a band on 60 meters, and our 5 megahertz band is close enough to where the NTIA channel was. So a ham went over there with his mobile radio and was able to handle some of the weather reporting comms to other weather stations. And as the wind really began to howl in Slidell and New Orleans, and I'm sure Mississippi, here's this report. Losing trees. Well, that's certainly a report that things are tough. Well, that next morning, all of us here on the West Coast and those on the East Coast, we hadn't heard anything about New Orleans. And we thought, well, it must have been spared. And some of the news broadcasts were coming out saying that, well, we didn't get any reports of New Orleans getting hit with Katrina. And then they went on and on. Well, they didn't know what we as hams knew when that morning came and a ham radio operator in his mobile went to the top of a parking garage on 20 meters and came out with a break, a triple break. Can anyone handle this report? And here was his report that New Orleans was not okay.
New Orleans is shut down. New Orleans has got major destruction, and they've got the roof off the Superdome. They've got water in the. You probably know better from the national TV coverage than we do. We have no TV. All we have
is ham radio. So it points out that an emergency, ham radio continues to get through, even though many emergency groups have said, well, you know, the hams will just, you know, they're volunteers. They don't realize the value until they lose their AC, their DC, their internet. Then they see that ham radio operators can continue to handle emergency communications. Many of our radio calls were also intercepted by the National Hurricane Center. And the National Hurricane Center does a fabulous job protecting you down in the southern region, Mississippi, and so on. And they have a commanding signal that we could hear all the way out here in California. Take a look.
And the forecast is to predict
landfall and tracking of the hurricane. That said, are there any stations on the southwest coast of Florida that have hurricane strength winds?
The hams really came in and helped out. Well, now let's head up to the Northeast. And we all remember the morning of 9/11 and New York City. Here was an operator walking down 42nd Street, and he looked up, he heard an explosion, and for a minute or so, and we'll cut it down to just a few seconds, he was speechless. Yet he had the microphone keyed, and we were hearing the sirens in the background. And then listen to what he has to say.
We're that the town of one is on fire. We have on fire, so it's like the plane with Amy going to the building, back with a third alarm, where I can think there. I don't know what to do. I have the third alarm, I'm going into that area, that's all I'm on. Okay. All right.
So it points out that as a good emergency operator, a good ham, you've got to have great ears to be hearing some of these calls coming in with all of the noise in the background. And then again, we need to know where that traffic is going to be routed to. And this one went to the American Red Cross, which was in New Jersey, who were handling a drill, and that drill turned in to be the real thing. Well, then, of course, we learned about the Pentagon. And here is a ham indicating that the collision, the aircraft into the Pentagon was of such magnitude that it felt like an earthquake. Listen to this call. Wow. So it points out a lot of things happening there. Well, now let's go and see what the hams are doing out in Los Angeles. And we had just a little teeny earthquake. Well, it was actually a little bigger than we had anticipated.
Damage report on freeway. Go ahead with the damage report on freeway.
Oh, well, that was quite a report. And those of us that live out here on the West Coast, we get a lot of earthquakes. And when we hear something like that, we know, well, I guess I'm not going to take that particular freeway if they're talking about chunks of concrete coming up. But here's one report from a ham operator and a lady control operator. And ladies out there with the Vicksburg Amateur Radio Club, you make great dispatchers because we can always hear your voice when you could say, again, where are you located? And here is this ham's report. We'll play it once and then see if you can figure out what he is saying. What? One more time? The bridges are down on a freeway in Los Angeles? Yep, that was the big Northridge earthquake, and that really got the attention of a lot of hams. And again, ham radio, one of the first calls to alert the California Highway Patrol that this was a big deal and that two freeways were off the air because, as you heard, the bridges are down. Now, take a listen to this particular call. Now, wait a minute. First in Westchester, and then a few seconds later in Thousand Oaks. How would a ham know that? by being on the air. And earthquakes do not travel at the speed of our radios. Nope, they don't travel at 300 million. You got it. They travel actually a lot slower in the ground. So you may have a ham 100 miles away going, whoa, I just had a big earthquake. And that may be giving you up to 5 to 10 seconds of warning before that earthquake gets to your neck of the woods. So remember, earthquakes, when you hear those calls, they travel a lot slower than the radio waves. All right, there's more. Hang on. Now, that was a report from 80 meters. How many of you are on high frequency? Can I see your hands? How many high frequency operators? Oh, that's terrific. Well, coming up on 80 meters is no easy task because your antenna is a mere 128 feet, but it's important that you get down to 80 to be able to handle some of these local reports. Wow. Well, that was a pretty good report. So all of these hams are coming up on the 2-meter band. They're giving nice short reports. So other hams that might have emergency traffic can come in an emergency. They can listen. Now, wait a minute. The bird went crazy. Do we really want to hear that in an emergency call? Yes, because many times hams have a favorite pet and they're just like kids to them. They're children. So if somebody says my dog or my cat or my bird, take a listen. Do not tell them we aren't interested in your bird. Yeah, we are, because we're all part of a team, and that's part of our team. So that was a report that came through during our big earthquake. And here's one more. So, wow, earthquakes really mean a lot of damage to the infrastructure of certainly Los Angeles when we had ours. But what about that high frequency call from a station in Japan saying that they had just experienced an earthquake and that the Japanese nuclear power plant was crumbling and falling into the ocean? Well, that's a tsunami warning that's going to go out. And on that tsunami warning, the radio call went out, and the first that folks would be concerned with was Hawaii. So Hawaii had hams that responded to all areas in Hawaii that overlooked Hilo Harbor and Honolulu Harbor. Here is a ham that's broadcasting near Hilo Harbor when that Japanese tsunami began to inundate the Hawaiian Islands. Here's ham on 20 meters.
Just an update from the Big Island. As well as a couple of features, so just pass the information along. I'm on the southern end, and that's through the coastal stream of Hawaii. That's the net to
Well, there's something to learn from. If you're at the beach and they say there's been a tsunami that's been reported, and all of a sudden you see the water receding, that is going out like low tide, stand by. I wouldn't even stand by. I would run in the opposite direction, because when that tsunami hits, it's not going to be a big breaker that you're watching coming in, but rather it's going to be like high tide on steroids that's going to immediately begin flooding. So anytime you're in a tsunami situation and you see the water go out, be assured it's going to come back in. Well, now here's one that ham radio operators really saved lives on. And this was a school bus on a remote road that, well, take a listen as to what happened when one of the hams aboard the school bus as a chaperone, they were on a field trip, came up with this report. Chilling report.
kids on it, 50 yards south of Fort Canyon.
From ham operators that see on the number of patients that might be involved at control wire. We can check with our hospital resources and advise them of the number of casualties and advise.
So very important that when you come across an accident scene, you try and get as much information along with the exact location of the accident as to what you are going to be seeing as injured patients, fatalities, and that will let rescue agencies know whether or not they may launch a helicopter to be able to come in. And here's a report from a ham that is going to be spelling a medication that one of the injured students will need when they ultimately are transferred to a local hospital on this remote area. And you wonder why on the examination for technician in general, they have a test question about phonetics, Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, Delta. Well, here's an answer because, well, you take a listen. They're going to give you some needed phonetics.
It's that perfect. You got 5 minutes. I want to fight heavily. I smell. Mike, Lima, Oscar, Delta, India, Papa, India, November, Echo, Edward, Bravo, Echo, Sierra, Yankee, Lima, Alpha, Tango, Echo, 5 milligrams.
Oh, wow. I'm glad he spelled it because I never would have been able to reproduce what he was saying, but he did it absolutely letter perfect. Well, this bus collided with something, and who knows what. They thought maybe it just rounded a curve and turned over. One of the hams was inspecting the scene to make sure there wasn't any other injuries. And oh yeah, take a listen to this from a ham radio operator on the 2-meter band. Here it comes.
With a car that we just discovered halfway down the hill at Falls Canyon and Avalon Canyon. Overturned on the south side of Avalon Canyon Drive. 2 occupants are trapped beneath the jaws of life. Both occupants are alive but severely injured. W6NOA.
Well, that was an excellent report. See, ladies, you come through loud and clear. So the jaws of life were needed for that one. Well, the question is, they're in a remote area. Hams in remote areas many times will have pre-assigned locations that they go to. And one ham went to the local hospital just to let the hospital team know what was incoming. And here was that report of what's incoming.
Are able is unrelated.
So ham radio in an emergency is a lifesaver. There's been a lot of additions to our telecommunications that municipalities have. They've gone to trunking system. They've gone to encryption. They've gone to 800. They've got computer-aided dispatch, CAD systems. So no longer can you just plug in a scanner and hear what the local fire or the local public safety is doing. But when it comes time in a wide emergency, many times those computer systems will be either slowed down or will decay to the point that it's faster to send a ham radio message. And how many of you are into digital ham radio communications? How many do digital? Okay, there's a few. And D-Star and DMR, these are all, Yaesu has their fusion system. These are all good because many times in the digital mode, you can send traffic computerized and be able to send long lists of evacuation center requirements that they need supplies of. So very, very important. And you never really know what's going to happen in ham radio. And this will be the last one I'll play. And you can imagine this was on either Christmas Eve or Christmas Day. And I was on the 20-meter band on the Pacific Maritime 14300 net. And here comes a report from a sailor. And well, you take a listen.
The Lightner reports 31,000 casualties with ocean waters covering all southern and eastern coastlines. The estimate is 800,000 homeless and in need of medical supplies. Ham radio operators needed immediately with high frequency radios.
So high frequency still remains so important to public safety officials if they knew what it was all about. And more agencies here on the West Coast are re-equipping their EOCs with high frequencies with some of the shares channels, as well as inviting local hams to come in and work with them so they better understand how to get a high frequency message from here up the line, maybe 500 or 600 miles to the state capital. Not a clue that they have, because they've not been trained as a ham about the ionosphere and D layer absorption or F2 layer interference. They just want to get the message through. So still some great opportunities for all of us to work with our served agency and let them know how ham radio can do many different things, including mesh networks to try and hold some of those frequencies we're barely holding on to at 3 gigahertz and 5 gigahertz. Everybody's trying to take our frequencies, but luckily the American Radio Relay League is doing a great job in making sure that we don't lose any more than the few that we've lost. So I compliment all of you for your interest in emergency comms, and you can only imagine the photos, as well as probably some that you've taken yourself, of the devastation areas after a hurricane hits. So let's hope for a nice, quiet fall without any hurricanes inching up the Gulf in your direction, and we'll try and keep the earthquakes down at this direction. And I'll now take any questions that you might have. And oh yes, CW is still a very important part of an emergency, because if you watch the screen now, you're going to see that did you copy that? That was SOS. That could be someone trapped and pounding on the side of a pipe that they're buried under, or a building that they're buried on. So knowing CW is important for all ham radio operators. Even though you might not hear it, you might be able to feel it or barely hear a little pounding. That's an emergency that we can handle. All right, I'll now go back to Chris and Frank and all of your team with any questions, and if they'll relay them, I'll be able to hear them loud and clear. Go ahead.
Okay, folks. Now I know Jerry actually wanted to follow up from courtside. He's got a question for you, Jerry.
Yeah, now when I was out there, you was working with the Tai
Tai Chi. He's recollecting your Tai Chi.
It didn't look like you were doing too good. Have you progressed on that?
And would you relay, please?
Yes. How are you doing with your Tai Chi? He said in courtside, you and some females were doing some Tai Chi dancing. How are you doing with that, Gordon?
I'm still hurting. That was like 2 years ago, and I'm still sore. So let me tell you, while it looks like slow motion, by the time you get through, you go, wow, I didn't know I had that much what's left over muscle in that shoulder. So I'm doing okay. But you're right, Jerry. It's great for exercise.
Okay, we've got a couple of people from Civil Air Patrol, and Scott Larson, who's the vice president of the club, is going to ask you something about CAP on the West Coast, aren't you, Scott? Yes, you are.
All right. Well, for Scott, yes, we do have Civil Air Patrol, and occasionally we hear them on the air doing drills. And it's sad that we're right next to the ocean here in Orange County, our local harbor, and I work with a Coast Guard auxiliary, and occasionally we have emergency position indicating radio beacons go off in the harbor. And the Harbor Patrol says, that's beyond us. Let's get a ham or somebody to help out. So they get a hold of the Coast Guard auxiliary that has hams on board, and we've got the equipment to find it. But we're trying to get the Civil Air Patrol to get involved in that. And they're saying, oh, wow, that could be a good possibility. So again, those units that have a served agency that recognize the Civil Air Patrol and all that they can do in finding personal locator beacons, which are EPIRBs, but they're on 121.5 as a PLB, and we've got the DFing equipment. There's a lot we can do. So CAP is a great asset, but only if the served agencies around you know these capabilities that you can use as volunteers. So their personnel wandering around with a little helper, DFer, they might not know how to do it, but CAP operators are well trained. So we sure support them as well.
Well, Gordo, our people here, and Scott being one of them, they are trying to encourage some of the cadets in CAP to get more interested in amateur radio, so can kind of bridge some of that. This particular group has HF in the EOC. Drew, our Secretary Treasurer, don't we have some HF capability?
HF and VHF.
HF and VHF. So this group has been fairly ardent in working and has a good relationship, right, Chris, with the EOC here in Vicksburg. Our president's from Port Gibson. You'll have to excuse me, Gordo. I'll have to tell you how to pronounce Port Gibson. There's no R in Port Gibson.
Oh, okay, got it.
So there's a nuclear power plant there, and Chris works in the electric power industry. So we're kind of spread out. I'm from over north of Jackson. So I think there's for small towns that are spread out, there's a decent amount. We can always get better, but a decent amount of involvement with our EMA directors and our EOC. Any other questions? Anyone?
Oh, Gordon mentioned shares.
Shares, yes.
We had the director of shares here last week.
We had our shares director here last week.
National director.
The national director, yes.
Jerry Sessions.
Jerry Sessions lives here part-time and he's back and forth to DC, and he's a member of this club. And so we try to engage him when we can. You know, he's not always here, but we're blessed to have him here at times.
Yeah, and luckily we're blessed in Washington, D.C. to have a few hams that are part of emergency comms up there say, let's get more agencies using shares, including the American Red Cross and city emergency groups, because shares really offers some great capabilities to get the message through over high frequency NTIA non-ham channels.
Right. Gordo, everybody remembers Walter Cronkite, who was a ham radio operator. Not as many people would realize that the news reporter Jamie Dupree is also an active ham and participates in contests and things, and has even admitted sneaking to his office and working FT8 while working on a story and waiting for a callback. So it's good for us to know who the reporters are and that sort of thing. So
Well,
questions from anyone?
It sure is. And, you know, FT8 is terrific for propagation studies, and hopefully it'll get more hams tuned into not only just doing FT8, but able to then understand propagation to the point they'll come up on HF voice or digital and handle those calls too.
Gordo is active frequently on a 40-meter net in the morning, and I have listened to that net through a web SDR server in Texas. Yes, and so I will hear Gordo frequently remotely. Well, if there are no other questions, let's give Gordo a good Vicksburg welcome. Thank you.
Well, it's been a pleasure to talk to the Vicksburg Amateur Radio Club, and Chris and Frank and all of you. Thank you so much for having us on board. My wife in the background, who helps me with all of our training materials, is saying good for all of you. So enjoy your weather. Let's have no major hurricanes coming ashore, and see how ham radio is going to save the day again and again. So very 73 from our earthquake shack here in Southern California.
Gordo, you and your wife have a great Thanksgiving on the beach, okay?
Will do. 14,275 plus or minus 5, and we'll be on Thanksgiving Day about 1 or 2 in the afternoon your time. Hope to work you there.
7-3.